When you think about games for the Halloween spooky season, it's all too common that your Resident Evils, Silent Hills, and even Luigi's Mansions come to mind as appropriate games to play. There is, however, a slightly more niche series made by PlayStation that fits the theme to a T, and that would be the series MediEvil. Originally having started all the way back on the PS1 in 1998, and having had a PS1 sequel, MediEvil 2, released in the year 2000, and a PSP remake of the first game called MediEvil Resurrection in 2005, the MediEvil series was no stranger to spooking players around this time of year. Having been dead and buried for a good 14 years or so, developers Other Ocean Emeryville sought to resurrect this series once more, not with an original entry, but oddly enough, with another remake of the original game in 2019 on the PlayStation 4 simply titled MediEvil. Having recently played Astrobot and finding today's hero hiding out in one of the spooky levels, I knew that I had no choice but to bring you guys a review of this 2019 remake that was still sitting in the shrink wrap on my shelf from release day, and crack it open to see if it does a good job of reviving this long dormant series. The 2019 remake of MediEvil is an incredibly accurate and for the most part one-to-one recreation of the original game with updated visuals, so take this video not just as a review of the 2019 remake, but of the first MediEvil game as a whole. So what exactly is MediEvil about? 100 years ago in the kingdom of Gallowmere, the evil sorcerer Zarok waged war against the soldiers of Gallowmere, and it is said that he was defeated by the great hero Sir Daniel Fortescue, who went down in legend as a valiant hero. Truth is that Fortescue was killed when shot in the eye by the very first volley of arrows fired off in that war. The sorcerer Zarok has returned once again and resurrected the dead to build an undead army that can take over Gallowmere for good, and as such, Sir Daniel Fortescue has also been risen from his slumber. It will be up to him and him alone to take on the undead hordes of Zarok's minions, beat Zarok himself, and finally earn the mantle of hero that was wrongfully and shamefully given to him in death. This is pretty much the entire gist of what the story is for the whole game. You're not going to be seeing any crazy plot twists or hidden depth anywhere. The plot very much keeps things simple and straightforward, which does make for a very easy game for anyone to get into. Personally, when it comes to spooky games, if a game has a darker and more grown-up tone, then I prefer to have plenty of narrative depth, but if a game's a more light-hearted and goofy spooky kind of game, then I don't mind at all when it keeps things simple. The one way that the story is kept fun is that any and all dialogue in the game has a very strong sense of wit to it. Characters are weird and sarcastic as hell, and even though character interactions are few and far between, they are all fun to listen to because of the humour, writing style, and great voice acting.
So, even from the shackles of death, my old enemy pursues me. You're too late, Fortescue. Already my army has risen from the grave. You will never leave this necropolis.
There aren't very many characters in this game to be talking to. Each level has a talking gargoyle or two to prattle nonsense at you, with the game having a few human characters in an area called the Hall of Heroes that you can go to after each level is beaten. MediEvil is honestly a pretty funny game. If you don't have a sense of humour, then stay away from it, but there were more than a few times in my playthrough that I caught myself giggling at its very dry and British style. So if the story is straightforward but full of good humour, how is the gameplay? True to its roots with the original game, 2019's MediEvil is half 3D platformer and half action-adventure game. You'll be going through roughly 20 levels or so, which aren't too big or too small, and killing whatever minions Zarok has lying there, as well as collecting items for puzzles and resources. Combat is definitely the biggest focus as far as the gameplay is concerned, which is why it's such a shame that I have to say that the combat is not very good at all. There are several different kinds of both melee and range weapons on offer, and the game does give a nice sense of progression with power as you gain these extra weapons, but the movement is just so floaty, and hitting an enemy has no real sense of impact at all, and it just leads to a very unsatisfying feeling for the most part. Sometimes you'll just be standing in the one spot, mashing the attack button as the enemy walks toward and into your swings, and yeah, you'll kill the enemy eventually, but you're going to take damage too. You can block enemy attacks with a shield, and the game does offer replacement shields decently often, but each shield will only take about 3 hits or so, and honestly, I just didn't find blocking to be beneficial compared to just taking the damage from the enemies. Like I said, there is a decent selection of weapons on offer here, from swords to giant hammers to magic spells and even bows and spears, and these don't just have use in combat. A lot of them serve purposes for accessing areas or solving puzzles in the environment, and getting weapons later on in the game does give fun reasons to go back to previous levels and access parts you couldn't before. I like that even if this is more or less a 3D platformer with a lot of action combat, the way that the gear and weapons works gives a slight Metroidvania vibe. A lot of these weapons might be missed if it's your first time through the game and you're not combing every level for every possible thing you can. As you go through the levels and kill Zarok's minions, their souls will be slowly accumulating into a chalice, and when it reaches 100% capacity in a level, you can go and collect this now completed chalice, which is how you talk to the heroes in the Hall of Heroes that I mentioned earlier. Every time you do collect a chalice, one of the heroes will give you a gift from a new powerful weapon, shield, or sometimes it's lame things like gold or health refills. This means that if you try to go through the game quickly and go straight from point A to B, then you're going to have a more and more difficult time as you go on, because your weaponry won't be upgrading to match the bigger threats. So it's definitely worth taking your time in the levels and doing as much as you can. Thankfully, health is not a rare commodity here, likely because the game was designed around the combat being so scuffed. As the game goes on and eagle-eyed players collect the health upgrades, you'll end up with more than a handful of health bars spare for when a really tough level messes you up. You'll be finding tiny health vials all scattered throughout the land which will heal you a little bit, and there's also big glowing health fountains which will fill more than an entire health bar. The one thing about the health that bugs me is that there is never a time that health automatically refills, so if you've gone through a tough level and only just made it out alive, then you're more than likely going to have to go back to one of the early stages and run through it a couple times just to refill your health bars, which just feels a little tedious for a game released in 2019. The levels do offer a decent variety of things you'll be doing. Some of them you'll just be fighting your way through the gauntlet, killing all enemies as you go, some you'll be exploring and collecting a certain amount of items to be able to progress, and some will be just straight up boss battles. Speaking of the bosses in the game, there is definitely more than a few here, and while some can seem a bit tricky at first, none of them were so tough that I was forced to replay a level just to give it another try. Thanks to the scuffed combat, plenty of health, and sometimes lack of challenge present, MediEvil can be a little easy at times, but I'm definitely not going to complain since I don't like repeating content too much, and the levels don't have checkpoints midway through them. I think the game does a really good job of making sure that you're going to have a cruisy enough time through it as long as you pay attention in your playthrough and keep up with gear upgrades. During my roughly 10-hour playthrough fighting to save Galomir, I can't say I was ever bored thanks to the variety of level objectives as well as the levels themselves. So speaking of the levels, how is the general design of the game? Being an incredibly faithful remake of the original MediEvil, I'm pleased to say that the strongest component of that original game, being its design, is also the strongest part of this remake. The levels have such a fun variety of locations and themes on offer that every time you go to a new level, you're going to want to smile. Anything Spooktober essential like creepy cemeteries, cornfields with scarecrows, pumpkin forests, evil psych wards, and flying pirate ships will be making up the roster of levels you'll be going to, and they all look stunning thanks to the increased detail that modern gaming can give us. The enemies do a good job of matching this vibe too. There's an absolute wealth of enemy types on offer, and so many of them have little strategies you can find to kill them more efficiently, and it's just so fun seeing what you'll be killing as you go into a new level. The one criticism I have about the visual design of this remake is that it looks a little bit, I don't know the word for it, Disneyified? MediEvil was never really a scary game and was always meant to just be fun vibes, but the new art style in the remake, while looking nice, feels like everything's been watered down a little bit and hit with a G-rated filter. The vibe of the game is still absolutely there and intact, but if you're expecting it to be a little moody like the PS1 original, then you might be a little disappointed in the new art style. The voice acting and sound effects still absolutely nail the atmosphere and tone of the game and sound exactly how I remember the PS1 version sounding as a child, and thankfully the music in the remake here is so fun to listen to. The soundtrack nails that all ages Halloween vibe perfectly, and I just really love everything about this game from an artistic and design perspective. Being a remake of an old and beloved game, you might be wondering if this game adds anything new to the table that the original game didn't have, and I'm happy to say that it does. Near the end of the game, you might find yourself an optional endgame questline that'll have a reward that all my older gamers in the audience will absolutely adore. The extra content itself is kind of mediocre. You'll be sent into the previous levels you've already beaten another 1 to 2 times each to find some hidden spots where you can find an extra hidden challenge. And yeah, some of them are fun, but some are so mediocre in content and tedious to find that you may as well just use a guide to find and do this optional content in as streamlined a way as possible. The extra content will likely last you an extra 2 hours or so, and unless you're a big fan of the series, then it might just not be worth doing, since when you do revisit a level to do these challenges, you also have to fully refinish the level and fight any enemies or bosses you did the first time around. It's really up to you and how much you care about the legacy of MediEvil. So now that we've summed up the game, what is the overall verdict? Well, before we get into that, you're gonna have to scroll down there and hit that subscribe button. It'll really help with me being able to get out as many reviews to you as soon as possible and is really appreciated. On with the verdict. While I am happy to say that this remake of MediEvil is a really fun game and I definitely enjoyed my new, prettier journey through Gallowmere, I'm sad to say that this entry's strict rule of sticking so closely to the source material is what ends up letting it down most. MediEvil is a really fun, creative and witty series, but has always been let down by its less than stellar combat and controls. The camera has definitely undergone an improvement since 1998, but for this game to truly shine and become a heavyweight for the Spooktober season, I feel like it needs a full gameplay overhaul with more modern combat that can feel both fun and goofy. I admire the developers of this game's love to the original, but I also can't sit back and pretend that it isn't a flawed base to be working off of. Don't let that deter you from a very fun and charming romp through the epitome of what a Halloween game is. If you have a PlayStation and this game is on offer, then consider giving it a go. That is, unless you only have a base PS4 where this only runs at 30 FPS. I really do hope that one day this series will get a new and original entry that can take all the good things this game does while ironing out some of the kinks in gameplay. I will be giving the 2019 remake of MediEvil a score of 7 out of 10. Sony, you better bring me a 4K re-release of MediEvil 2 on the Australian PlayStation Store because I have never been able to play that game and it has been on my list for over a decade. Like, come on man, stop dropping the ball on these PS1 re-releases. That's going to be about it for the review today guys. Thanks for watching.